I never imagined myself in this line of work. At 55, I thought I'd be winding down, not starting over. But here I am, standing on the edge of a large oil rig, surrounded by steel, rust, and the ever-present hum of machinery. I've been here a month, though it feels like years. It wasn't my idea to take this job. Hell, I'd probably still be at my old one if it weren't for my wife, Janet. We were barely scraping by. The kids are growing up fast, and the bills were piling up higher than I could manage. Janet's always been practical, always thinking ahead. She said it was the only option. This job would pay well enough to get us out of the mess we were in. I wasn't so sure, but I couldn't keep saying no. Not with 3 kids, a mortgage, and a wife who wanted stability. She pushed, and here I am, working 12-hour shifts on this noisy rig in the middle of nowhere. I don't know anyone here. Most of the men have been working this kind of job for years, and they've got this camaraderie, like they've seen it all. I'm just trying to get by, keep my head down, and make it through without making a fool of myself. It's all so unfamiliar. Being away from home for weeks at a time, living in small quarters with men who could care less about me, and working harder than I ever did in my office job. I don't mind the hard work, but it's the loneliness that gets to me. Being away from Janet and the kids, that's the hardest part. I wake up every day at 4:30, get dressed in the thick orange suit they gave me, and head to the mess hall for breakfast. The food is terrible, just like the conversations. Most of the guys don't even talk to each other much. They just eat and go. There's a strange peace in that, actually. No one expects anything from you. My first week was rough. I didn't understand half of what the crew was talking about, and every time I asked a question, I could feel their eyes on me. They looked at me like I was a kid, someone who had no business being here. I got the feeling I was seen as just another guy who was desperate for work. But then again, I was desperate. It wasn't just the money. It was the pressure, the weight of being the man of the house, the one who was supposed to provide. When you can't provide, it feels like you're failing in every way that matters. Janet's been strong through it all, but I know it's wearing on her, too. She tries to act like it doesn't bother her, but I see it. I feel it. I haven't told her yet about the tension at work, how I feel like an outsider, how I'm still learning the ropes, trying to fit in. The work's hard and the pay's good, but the isolation is another thing entirely. I miss my kids. I miss Janet, the rig, the noise, the cold steel beneath my feet. Nothing feels real out here, but that's what I tell myself every morning. Just get through today, one day at a time. When I finish my shift and head back to the cramped bunk where I'll sleep for the night, I remind myself why I'm here. I have to, because if I didn't, I might just lose it. The loneliness, the exhaustion, and the constant grind, they're starting to get to me. But I can't let it show. Not yet. Jim's story isn't over. Not by a long shot. But for now, all I can do is keep going. The oil rig was out in the field, far from anything that resembled civilization. A few miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but wide, empty plains and endless stretches of dirt. It stood like a giant mechanical spider, its metal legs embedded deep in the earth. The pump jack constantly moved, rhythmically pulling oil from the well below. The hum of the rig, the sound of metal grinding and hydraulic systems working in tandem, was the only noise you could hear. There was no escaping it. I quickly learned to block it out. I remember walking onto that rig for the first time, my stomach tight with nerves. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. The towering structure of pipes, metal beams, and machinery made me feel small, insignificant. The workers, most of whom were weathered and used to the harsh conditions, barely acknowledged me. But they didn't have to. They knew I was the newbie, the one who didn't belong. The shift was set for 3 months. 3 months of being away from home, from Janet, from the kids. 3 months of living in cramped quarters with men I barely knew, in a place that felt like a different world. The rotation was simple. Work for 3 months straight, then head home for a month. Over and over again. They say you get used to it. I wasn't sure I was ever going to get used to it. My first week was a blur. I was told to monitor the sensors on the equipment. Easy enough, they said. The job itself wasn't complicated, just tedious. The hardest part was trying to remember all the little things. Which buttons to push, which screens to check, which alarms to pay attention to. When everything was running smoothly, you just watched the sensors, made sure they stayed in the green, and waited. But when something went wrong, you were expected to call the workers to fix it. It seemed simple enough, but when you're standing there in the middle of nowhere, with your heart pounding and a machine blaring, it's a whole different story. At first, I had to ask a lot of questions, and every time I did, the crew would give me a quick explanation, and then they'd go back to what they were doing. They didn't have time for me to be slow. They were here to work, and I had to keep up. The crew didn't say much to me. Some of them were friendly enough, but I could tell they saw me as a temporary fixture, a guy who was just passing through, who didn't belong here. It wasn't their fault. They'd been doing this for years. They had a rhythm, a routine, and I was a disruption. But little by little, I started to get the hang of it. I learned how to monitor the sensors without thinking too much about it, how to spot problems before they became emergencies. I'd catch myself becoming more comfortable, more confident in my role. But that didn't mean I was part of the team. The hardest part, though, wasn't the work. It was the isolation. It was the fact that I was so far away from home that I could only talk to Jen on the phone once a week. And even then, it wasn't the same. It never felt the same. I miss my kids. I miss being there for them, seeing them grow up. It was hard to reconcile the fact that I was doing this for them. 3 months felt like forever. Every time I thought I'd gotten used to it, the loneliness would hit me again. I tried to keep my head down, work hard, and remind myself that this was temporary. But with each passing day, it felt less and less temporary. It felt like a lifetime. This was my new life now, and I was just trying to make it through, one day at a time. After a week of settling in, getting used to the routine and figuring out the technicalities of the job, something happened that I'll never forget. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren landscape around the rig. I was just finishing up my shift when we heard it. A deep, bone-chilling roar echoed from outside the perimeter, followed by a growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe the sound of some animal scavenging nearby. But when the noise came again, louder and more primal, we all froze. Jack, the old worker who had been training me and the other newbies, didn't flinch. He had an unnerving calm about him that made me uneasy. He looked over at us, his weathered face stern. "You need to get inside. Now," he said in a low voice, pointing toward the building. We didn't need to be told twice. The urgency in his voice was enough to get everyone moving. As we jogged toward the door, I turned to Jack. "What's going on, Jack? What the hell is that noise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He paused for a moment before answering, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the distance, toward the sound. "Those aren't ordinary hyenas," he said quietly. "They're mutated. They've been drinking the oil. Or, rather, the waste from the oil, the stuff that gets spilled, the leftovers that we don't use. They've gotten into it, and it's turned them into something else, something dangerous." I didn't understand what he meant at first. Hyenas drinking oil? I thought it was some kind of joke or exaggeration, but when I looked at the faces of the others, some of them as pale as ghosts, some with fear clearly written in their eyes, I realized he was serious. This was no joke. Jack led us inside the main building, his pace quickening. We huddled in the control room as he shut the door behind us with a firm bang. The noise from outside had intensified, the growls and shrieks reverberating off the walls. It sounded like a pack circling the rig. I felt my pulse quicken. Jack turned to us, his face grim. "Those things are hungry, and they've got a taste for blood now." He pulled a box from a shelf and began handing out rifles to each of us. I took mine hesitantly. the weight of it unfamiliar in my hands. "Keep quiet. Don't let them know we're here," Jack said, his voice almost a whisper. "If we wait them out, they'll eventually leave, but if they smell us or hear us moving, we're in for a hell of a fight." I tried to steady my breathing as I gripped the rifle. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt truly scared. This was real. These were no wild animals. This was something far worse. We took positions around the room, keeping our eyes on the windows, listening to the shrieks and howls that seemed to be getting closer. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only a matter of minutes. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. Jack gave us a nod, signaling that we needed to be ready. I felt a knot in my stomach as I peered out the window, trying to spot any movement in the darkness. I'd seen a lot in my life. Rough days in the oil fields, tough jobs, long shifts, but nothing prepared me for this. These weren't just wild animals. These were mutated creatures, made dangerous by something we were responsible for, something we'd ignored. And now, they were coming for us. The growls grew louder again, and I heard something heavy slam against the fence. The gate screeched in protest, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "Stay low. Stay quiet," Jack whispered. "This isn't just a fight for survival. It's a reminder of what happens when we don't pay attention to the damage we're causing. Now, we're gonna face the consequences." My palms were sweaty on the rifle. I didn't want to think about what would happen next. I just wanted to survive. The tension in the room was palpable. Every creak of the building, every distant thud from outside sent a shockwave of anxiety through me. I glanced around at the others. Some of them were holding their rifles with shaky hands. Others had their eyes wide, fixed on the windows, clearly unable to fully grasp the reality of what we were facing. Jack moved quietly from one corner to another, his weathered face calm, though his eyes betrayed a deep concern. "Stay alert," he said again, his voice steady. "If we hear them breach the fence, that's when we need to act." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but I forced myself to take deep, slow breaths. I had been in tough situations before, but this was different. We weren't just fighting for a paycheck or a task. We were fighting for our lives. The first sign that something had changed came when the growling stopped. The air went deathly silent. No sounds of movement. No rustling in the distance. Nothing. We all exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for the next noise to break the silence. A minute passed, then another. My hand tightened around the rifle as I waited for the inevitable, unsure of how to react to this sudden stillness. Then came the sound, a screech, a horrible, screeching noise that echoed through the night air. It wasn't just a growl now. It was a shriek, almost like something was being torn apart. The sound was so unsettling. I could feel it vibrating in my bones. "Stay low," Jack barked, his voice snapping me out of my trance. We ducked behind the equipment, our rifles at the ready. Then I saw it. A figure, or at least part of one, darted across the window, a flash of dark, twisted shapes, and then nothing. It was like it wasn't even human anymore. The animal that had once been a hyena was now something far worse. Its body was distorted, hunched and unnaturally large, its eyes glowing in the dim light. My heart stopped for a moment. This creature, had the shape of a hyena, but the way it moved, the way it skittered across the ground, it was wrong. It was a monster, something that shouldn't exist. "They've come through the fence," one of the other workers whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, my throat dry. I didn't have a plan. There was no plan. We were surrounded by mutants, creatures we had no way of understanding, and it seemed like there was no way out. Then another creature appeared, and another. Soon, we could see several of them creeping through the dark shadows around the building. Their eyes glowed, reflecting the faint light from inside. They were hungry, desperate, and angry. "Get ready," Jack said, his voice grim. We can't just wait for them to get inside. When they charge, we'll have to make a stand. I didn't know what we could do. The creatures were fast and vicious. The fence, while sturdy, had already been breached, and there was no way to know how many of them there were. They could be surrounding the entire building by now, ready to pounce. The silence was broken by another shriek, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. They were trying to break in. One of the creatures had already reached the door, its distorted form pressing against the glass, eyes wild, mouth foaming. Jack nodded to me, signaling that it was time to act. When they break through, shoot to kill. Don't hesitate. We don't get a second chance. The air was thick with anticipation as we prepared ourselves for the worst. The creatures were getting closer. We could hear their claws clicking against the concrete, their growls echoing in the distance, growing louder. We were on the edge, waiting for the moment when everything would descend into chaos. Then, with a deafening crash, the door shuttered under the weight of the creature trying to break in. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Jack raised his rifle ready. "Get ready," he hissed. "Here they come." And just like that, all hell broke loose. The door slammed against the wall as the first mutant hyena crashed through, its twisted form a grotesque blur of jagged limbs and glowing eyes. Its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of jagged teeth as it let out a bone-chilling snarl. I fired instinctively, the shot ringing out, but it missed, the creature too fast, too erratic. I could feel the air thick with tension, the sound of our rifles blasting into the night, mingling with the shrieks of the hyenas. The second one came in, its claws scraping the floor as it sprinted toward us with terrifying speed. This one was faster, more agile, and before I could react, it lunged at one of the workers beside me. I watched in horror as it swiped its claws across his chest, sending him flying into the wall with a sickening thud. Blood splattered across the floor, and his screams echoed through the building before he fell silent, his body twitching in an unnatural way. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't afford to freeze. Not now. Not when we were surrounded. I aimed again, this time my heart pounding in my ears as I squeezed the trigger, hitting one of the creatures square in the head. It let out a guttural screech, its head jerking back violently before it crumpled to the floor, motionless. "Keep firing. Don't let them get too close," Jack shouted, his voice strained but commanding. He fired off several rounds, his shots hitting their marks with alarming accuracy. The creatures didn't relent. More of them poured in, their distorted bodies crashing into the building. Some tried to climb to the windows, while others pounded against the walls, trying to break in from all sides. The noise was deafening, the flashes of gunfire lighting up the dark space, but I could hardly hear anything over the howling and growling of the hyenas. I backed into a corner with another worker, trying to reload my rifle while keeping an eye on the growing swarm. The creature's eyes locked onto mine for a moment, and I froze, feeling a chill run down my spine as it lunged toward me. But before it could reach me, Jack fired another shot, striking it in the chest. It crumpled to the floor, twitching violently before it finally went still. But there was no time to rest. The creatures kept coming, their numbers seeming to grow by the minute. We were running low on ammo, and I could feel the hopelessness creeping in. "We need to make a run for the supply shed," Jack said, his voice calm despite the chaos around us. "There's more equipment in there. We can fight back." I glanced around the room, seeing that we were outnumbered, and I nodded. The idea of running into the open wasn't ideal, but staying trapped inside wasn't any better. "On my count," Jack ordered. 3, 2, 1, move. We bolted toward the exit, dodging the creatures as best as we could. The hyenas were faster than I ever expected, their growls echoing in the tight space as they chased after us, their movements jerky but relentless. We sprinted through the building, the supply shed just ahead, when suddenly I felt a sharp pain shoot up my leg. One of the creatures had caught me, its claws sinking into my calf, and I cried out in pain. I swung my rifle back and fired a shot, hitting it in the side, and the creature released me with a sickening hiss. I stumbled, my leg giving out, but I managed to push myself to the door of the supply shed. Jack and the others had already made it inside, and I followed them, slamming the door shut behind me. The sound of the creature scratching at the door was deafening, but we were momentarily safe. At least for now. Get the rest of the weapons fast, Jack said, his eyes scanning the room. We can't let them break in here. I limped over to a metal cabinet, my hands shaking as I tried to open it. My leg throbbed with every movement, but the adrenaline kept me going. The creatures were still outside, their growls mixing with the sounds of our frantic preparations. We need to make it out of here, I muttered to myself. We have to, but I knew deep down that escaping wouldn't be easy. These creatures were relentless, and we were trapped in a building with limited supplies. There was no guarantee we'd make it out alive. As I grabbed another rifle and a handful of ammo, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. The creatures we were up against were nothing like any hyena I had ever seen in nature documentaries or books. These were something else entirely. Their skin had a sickly, unnatural green tint to it, like they had been soaked in something toxic for too long. The fur that covered their bodies was a matted brown, patchy in some places, as though they'd been through more than a few fights. Or maybe it was the oil that did that to them. But what struck me most was their eyes. They were wild, unhinged, like something straight out of a nightmare. There was no sign of intelligence in them, just pure, maddened aggression. Their skin was horribly damaged, torn and cut up in ways that didn't make sense. It looked like it was peeling away from their muscles, like the oil they had consumed had started breaking down their bodies from the inside out. You could see patches where the skin was just hanging off, exposing raw, bloody tissue beneath. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to look away from. And then, of course, their size. These weren't like the hyenas you see in the wild. No, these were monstrous, easily 2 or 3 times the size of a regular hyena, their limbs thick and bulging with unnatural muscle. When they moved, it was almost like they were more predator than animal, each step sending a tremor through the ground. They were terrifying, and knowing what they had become because of the oil made it all the more horrifying. These creatures weren't just mutated. They were part of something bigger, something we couldn't understand, and that's what made them so dangerous. Every time one of them appeared, I could feel my pulse race. The sight of them, with their twisted forms and feral instincts, left me with the sense that we were in the middle of something we couldn't control. And it was just beginning. The first night after we spotted them, the tension was unbearable. We had locked ourselves in the building, trying to stay quiet and keep low. The sounds of the hyenas growling and scraping at the fence were like a constant hum in the background. Every so often, one of them would howl, a sound so eerie it sent chills down your spine. We sat there, waiting, hearts pounding in our chests, hoping they wouldn't find a way in. Jack had explained that these mutants weren't just wild animals. They were smarter than that. They were driven by hunger, a hunger for the oil. They'd been living off whatever scraps they could find, and now, with the scent of the oil refinery all around, they were relentless. And they weren't leaving. The guns Jack handed out were our only defense. He told us to keep them close, to be ready if the creatures breached the perimeter. But as we sat in that small room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't just the hyenas. It was the isolation, the fact that we were so far from help. If anything went wrong, there would be no one to come for us. The oil rig was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. If we didn't make it out alive, we'd be forgotten, just another horror story lost in the vast, empty desert. By the second night, things started to escalate. The hyenas were circling the building, their growls growing louder and more frantic. We could hear them clawing at the walls, scratching and pushing at anything they could reach. I'm not sure what kept them from breaking through, but for some reason, they didn't attack right away. Jack was in charge, but it felt like the more time passed, the more he started to lose control. He'd been on this rig longer than any of us, But the sight of these creatures and the way they seemed to grow in number every time we looked outside was getting to him. His calm demeanor was cracking, replaced by something darker, more desperate. He told us to stay armed, to be ready to fight at any moment. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear we all felt. Then, on the third night it happened, we'd been sitting in the dark, waiting for the hyenas to make their move. But what came next wasn't something any of us could have predicted. A loud crash echoed from the side of the building, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy scraping against the metal walls. One of the hyenas had breached the fence. It was only a matter of time before more followed. Panic set in. Jack yelled for us to get to the emergency exits, to fall back to the secondary defense line. But we were too slow. The door to the room we were in was suddenly smashed open, and the first hyena lunged at us, its sharp teeth bared. I barely had time to react. All I could do was aim the gun and fire, hoping the sound of the shot would drive it back. The hyena screeched, staggering back, but it wasn't enough. There were more of them, and they were already on us. The air was thick with chaos. We fired blindly into the dark, the sound of gunshots mingling with the howls of the hyenas. I could hear Jack shouting orders, but it was hard to make sense of anything in the confusion. I just kept firing, my hands shaking as I tried to stay focused. But in the back of my mind, I knew we were losing. These creatures were too many, too strong, and we were just a handful of terrified men with guns in the middle of a nightmare. The shots kept echoing through the building, but the hyenas didn't back off. They kept charging at us, their twisted, mutated forms leaping through the broken doors, smashing windows with their bulk. I could hear the panic in Jack's voice as he barked orders, trying to organize a retreat to the secondary defense line. But it was too late. The creatures were already inside. I backed into a corner, trying to stay calm. My heart was racing, and every breath felt shallow, as if the air was being stolen from me. I couldn't focus. The growls, the screeches, and the clattering of weapons made my head spin. I kept firing, but the hyenas seemed unfazed. One of them lunged directly at me, its teeth snapping, but I fired a round just in time, hitting it square in the chest. It yelped, stumbling back, but I didn't have time to watch it fall. Another hyena was already behind me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. I turned just in time to see it pounce. My shot missed. It sank its teeth into my shoulder, and pain exploded through me. I screamed, trying to push it away, but it was too strong, too hungry. It pulled me to the ground, and I could feel its claws tearing at my flesh. I couldn't breathe. I was choking on the dust, on the blood, on the fear. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I was done for. But then there was a loud crash, a huge metal clang. I glanced up, just in time to see Jack, his face wild with terror, swinging a crowbar down on the hyena that had me. The creature howled in pain as it was knocked off me, allowing me to scramble back, gasping for air. But it wasn't over. More hyenas poured into the room, and we were overwhelmed. Jack was the only one still fighting, trying to push us toward the back exit, yelling for us to get out, get to safety. But it was no use. We couldn't hold them off. One by one, the other men fell, dragged down into the darkness. The hyenas tore through them like they were nothing. I ran. My body screamed in pain, but I pushed through, stumbling down the narrow hallways, unsure where I was going. I heard the sound of a hyena's growl behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to waste a second. I had to survive. I had to get out of there. I burst through the emergency door and found myself outside, gasping for breath. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I could hear the hyenas behind me, their heavy paws hitting the ground, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the rig, where I found the emergency escape ladder. I climbed it as quickly as I could, not looking back. The wind howled in my ears, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The ladder rattled beneath me, and I could hear the creatures getting closer, but I forced myself to keep moving. My body was on fire with pain, my shoulder bleeding badly. But I didn't stop. I reached the top of the ladder and saw the horizon. It was far away, but it was something, a promise of escape, a promise of life beyond this hellhole. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of the hyenas' howls echoing in the distance, their screams a haunting reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded on that oil rig. I woke up sometime later, the taste of salt and blood in my mouth. My head was heavy, and I couldn't remember where I was at first. The world felt distant and hazy, but I could hear the faint hum of machinery around me. Slowly, I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw being the dim light of an emergency cabin. The pain in my shoulder was unbearable, and I winced as I tried to sit up. My body felt like it had been hit by a truck. I glanced around, trying to make sense of things. I was lying on a cot. The walls were bare metal, and the air smelled sterile. A small window showed nothing but a vast stretch of the ocean. The oil rig, it was still there, I realized, though I couldn't quite remember how I had ended up here. My mind was foggy, my memories scattered like fragments of a broken mirror. Then it hit me. The hyenas, the screams, Jack, my colleagues. I had escaped barely, but I wasn't sure if anyone else had made it out alive. I needed to know. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak. Every part of me screamed in protest. My shoulder throbbed, but I ignored it, pushing through the pain. I stumbled toward the door and opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. I found myself in a small, cluttered hallway, lit by flickering lights. The rig seemed eerily quiet, far too quiet for something that should be bustling with activity. My footsteps echoed off the metal floors, but there was no sign of anyone else. No workers, no sound of equipment running. I reached a door that led outside, pulling it open cautiously. The wind hit me immediately, cold and salty, but it felt like a relief compared to the stifling air inside. I squinted against the bright sun, looking out at the open sea. There was no sign of the hyenas, no sound of their growls or snarls. But that didn't mean I was safe. I looked around for any sign of life, and that's when I saw it. Up ahead, there was movement, a figure. I froze, my heart racing again. It was a person stumbling toward me, their body limp. As they got closer, I realized it was one of the workers from my team, the only one I recognized. His face was pale, his clothes torn, but he was alive. "Jim!" His voice was raspy, weak, but he managed to get the words out. "I didn't think you made it." I helped him to the ground, urging him to sit. "What happened? Where's everyone else?" He looked at me with wide eyes, his lips trembling. "The hyenas, they got everyone. I thought I was done for, but I don't know how I survived. I didn't have the answers. I couldn't understand how we had survived, how the rig was still standing, but here we were, survivors in the middle of the ocean. We spent the next few hours trying to assess the situation. We found a few more workers hiding in different parts of the rig, but there was no sign of the hyenas anymore. It was as though they had disappeared into the night. We radioed for help, but the signal was dead. The communications had been destroyed during the attack. It was just us now, trapped in the middle of the ocean on a rig that seemed to be more of a death trap by the minute. As the sun began to set, we sat in silence, watching the waves roll by. The horrors of the past days were still fresh in my mind, the images of those mutated creatures haunting every thought. And the worst part was the uncertainty. We didn't know what was next, how long we would be stuck here, or whether help would ever arrive. But I did know one thing: we had survived. And for now, that was enough. The next few days blurred together as we settled into a routine of survival. The rig was silent, almost as if it had become a graveyard, a reminder of everything we had lost. The remaining workers, just 5 of us now, didn't speak much. What was there to say? We were all still processing the nightmare we'd lived through, each of us haunted by memories of the grotesque hyenas, their viciousness, their unnatural strength. We took stock of the supplies. We had food, water, and medical supplies, enough to survive for a few weeks, maybe more. But the worst part was the loneliness. We were isolated in the middle of the ocean. No communication, no way of knowing what was happening outside the rig. Had anyone else survived? Had anyone heard about the attack? And then there were the nights. The quiet was unbearable. When the sun set, the dark ocean stretched out before us like an endless void, and the wind would howl against the metal walls of the rig. Each gust of wind sounded like the creaking of bones. Each crash of the waves felt like something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to pull us under. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hyenas weren't the only danger on this rig. One night, as I lay in my bunk, I heard a noise. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaking of the structure, but then it came again, a soft scratching, almost imperceptible, like something dragging across metal. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was nothing, but the sound grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and grabbed a flashlight. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the area. The noise had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension, as if the rig itself was holding its breath. I turned the corner and froze. At the end of the hallway, I saw something, a shadow, a shape. It was too dark to make out clearly, but it wasn't human. It was hunched over, moving with unnatural speed. My breath caught in my throat as the creature moved closer, its shape becoming clearer. It was one of them, one of the hyenas, but it wasn't like the others. It was smaller, more agile, and it seemed to be following me. I backed up slowly, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. The creature made no sound as it moved, but I could hear its breathing, deep and ragged. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, my heart racing, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I reached the nearest door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. But the noise didn't stop. The scratching had begun again, this time louder, more persistent. I knew I couldn't stay in this room. I needed to get to the others. We needed to leave, but the rig felt like it was alive, like it was watching us, waiting for us to make a move. The thought of what might be lurking in the dark made my stomach turn. After what felt like hours, the scratching stopped. The silence returned, and I began to think that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the stress and fear taking their toll. But then I heard something else, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside. I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure how long I could keep running, how long I could survive on this rig with something out there hunting us. But one thing was clear. We were no longer just fighting for our lives against the hyenas. There was something else on this rig, something far more dangerous. And whatever it was coming for us.